All right, let's get right into it. Today, we are wading into a huge debate in the software world. It's a real tug-of-war that pretty much every developer faces at some point. Do you stick with the classic, trusty MVC, or do you go for the powerful, but sometimes controversial, clean architecture?
And let's be honest, this is the question at the heart of it all, isn't it? Is adopting something as intense as clean architecture a brilliant, future-proofing move? Or is it just a fancy way to make things way more complicated than they need to be?
So in one corner, you've got this sentiment, which you hear all the time. This quote from Reddit really nails it. Some developers feel like it's just bloatware. You end up with all these extra layers and boilerplate, and it can feel like you're spending more time building the scaffolding than the actual house. But then you've got the other side of the coin, and they're just as passionate. This developer points out that the initial build is just a tiny part of an app's life. The real game is maintenance, which can go on for years. And for that, extensibility, being able to add and change things easily, well, that's the holy grail.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll talk a bit more about the debate itself. Then, we'll do a quick refresher on our old friend MVC. After that, we'll bring in the challenger, clean architecture. Then, we'll put them head-to-head, pros and cons, and finally, we'll talk about how you can actually figure out the right fit for your project.
You know, this whole thing is kind of a rite of passage for developers. When you're moving up from junior to mid-level, you start hearing about all these complex enterprise-level patterns. You see these diagrams with circles and hexagons, and it's not always obvious why you'd ever need to leave the comfort of something simple like MVC.
So, let's start on some familiar ground. Most of us cut our teeth on MVC, right? Model View Controller? It's been the bread and butter of web development for decades for a very good reason. So let's do a quick recap of how it all works. At its core, MVC is all about separation of concerns. You've got three main jobs. The model, that's the brain. It handles all the data, all the business rules. The view, that's the pretty face. It's the UI, what the user actually sees and interacts with. And then you have the controller, which is basically the traffic cop that directs requests between the model and the view. The whole point is just to keep your data logic separate from your presentation logic.
So a typical flow goes something like this. You click a button in the view. The controller catches that click, figures out what you want to do, and tells the model, hey, update this data. The model does its thing, saves to the database, whatever, and then the view grabs that fresh data from the model and shows you the updated page. Simple, logical, and it works.
Okay, now let's switch gears and talk about the challenger, clean architecture. This is an idea that was really popularized by the one and only Robert C. Martin, who most of us know as Uncle Bob. And this isn't just another pattern, it's really a whole philosophy.
Clean architecture and its cousins like hexagonal or onion architecture, they all share one big overarching goal: to build a fortress around your core business logic. The idea is that your most important code shouldn't know or care whether you're using a web framework, what kind of database you have, or what the UI looks like. It should be totally and completely independent.
And the way it does this is with that classic diagram you've probably seen, the one with all the concentric circles. The idea is really simple. Right there in the bullseye, that's your most important high-level business rules. And as you move outward from the center, the code gets more and more specific to external details, things like databases, frameworks, and the UI.
Now, this right here, this is the secret sauce, the dependency rule. It's the one rule that makes the entire architecture work. And it's this: source code dependencies can only point inwards. So the UI layer can know about the business logic layer, but, and this is the key, the business logic layer can never know anything about the UI layer. It protects that precious core from the messy, changing outside world.
When you do this right, you end up with what Uncle Bob calls a screaming architecture. I love that term. The idea is, when you look at a building's blueprint, it should be obvious if it's a library or a house. Your code should be the same way. When I open your project, the folder structure should scream e-commerce system, not this is a Spring Boot app. The business domain should always come first.
So, now that we've laid out both philosophies, let's circle back to that big debate. Does clean architecture's purist approach actually pay off in the real world, or is it just a nice idea on paper?
So let's be real about the trade-offs. The pros are huge. Your core logic becomes incredibly testable, and it's totally independent of the tools you use. This makes long-term maintenance an absolute dream. But the cons, well, they're just as big. It's tough to learn, it can create a ton of boilerplate code, and for a simple project, it absolutely feels like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And I'm not kidding about that boilerplate. One developer on a forum estimated that a strict clean architecture implementation can make a codebase almost 3 times bigger than a more traditional approach. That is a lot of extra code to write, read, and maintain.
So where does this leave us? How are you supposed to decide which path to take? Is it really an all-or-nothing choice? Well, the answer might actually surprise you. And here it is, the big twist. The entire question of MVC versus clean architecture is the wrong question. It's based on a really common misunderstanding. These two things are not actually competing against each other.
Here's the solution. MVC is a design pattern for your presentation layer, the part the user interacts with. Clean architecture is a pattern for your entire application. They operate on totally different scales. They aren't mutually exclusive at all. In fact, you can use MVC as the pattern for one of the outer layers inside a clean architecture system. They can and often do live together in harmony.
So the real question you should be asking isn't which one should I use. It's how much architecture does my project actually need? If you're building a small app or a quick prototype, a simple MVC that your framework gives you is probably perfect. It's fast. But if you're building a large, complex application that you expect to be around for years and years, that's when the upfront investment in something like clean architecture starts to look like a really smart move.
And at the end of the day, it all comes down to this piece of wisdom. There is no silver bullet. There is no single best architecture. The best choice is always the one that fits your project, your team, and your long-term goals. The answer is always, it depends.
So I'll leave you with this final thought. Instead of getting hung up on MVC versus clean architecture, reframe the problem. Think about the application you're building and ask yourself this: what is its core purpose, and what does my project's architecture need to scream? Because whatever you choose, it should be screaming its purpose, loud and clear.